The sound comes first. Boots squelching through wet earth, the rhythmic crunch swallowed by the endless hiss of rain. Above, the canopy hangs low and suffocating, thick leaves pressing down the light, turning noon into twilight. The air is heavy enough to drink, every breath a burden. Beneath that living ceiling, more than 1,000 men move in single file, vanishing one after another into the emerald dark. It is the summer of 1942. The Japanese hold Burma, their empire spreading like wildfire through Asia. And now, into this inferno, the British 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, later known as the Chindits, marches to wage a new kind of war. At their head is a man as unorthodox as the mission itself, Major Orde Wingate, a zealot of irregular warfare, whose faith in endurance and surprise is matched only by his disregard for convention. The men carry packs heavier than their hope, rifles slick with condensation, leeches drop from branches onto sweating necks. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds so thick they seem to have weight. The jungle breathes around them, 1,000 unseen eyes in the undergrowth, a constant whisper of insects, the distant cry of something that might not be animal. Maps mean little here. Compasses spin as if magnetized by ghosts. Wingate has promised them glory through suffering. He believes this hell can be a weapon, that the jungle that kills can also conceal. But even faith has a temperature, and in this airless crucible, it begins to melt. Dysentery spreads faster than courage. Boots rot, flesh follows. Men hallucinate from fever and quinine, seeing home in the shimmer of swamp water. The rain never stops. It falls like judgment, erasing footprints, washing away the weak. When they emerge months later, there are barely 600 left. Skin stretched over bone, eyes hollowed by fever and disbelief. They speak little of what they've ever seen, because there are no words for it. The men who vanished mid-March, the screams swallowed by the green, the sense that the jungle itself had decided who would live and who would not. The rest remains somewhere out there, consumed by vines, bones turning to dust beneath the same relentless rain. What began as a mission of daring becomes something far more primal, a struggle between human endurance and nature's indifference. And it leaves us with one haunting question. What happens when modern soldiers confront a wilderness more hostile than any human enemy? Before they were soldiers, they were sons of farmers, laborers, teachers, and tailors. Some had never left their villages. Others had never fired a rifle outside the neat geometry of a parade ground. The 77th Indian Infantry Brigade was less an army and more an assembly of strangers, men from different continents bound by a single empire and a war that none of them had started. There were Punjabis who knew the rhythm of plowing fields better than marching drills. Gurkhas from Nepal, mountain men whose quiet resolve masked a ferocity that legend already whispered about. British privates from Lancashire and Yorkshire, their palms still calloused from factory machines. Anglo-Burmese interpreters caught between languages and loyalties. Teenagers from Calcutta, wide-eyed recruits who would learn the difference between bravery and survival far too soon. They gathered in the dust of central India, where the heat shimmered off the red earth and training camps buzzed with uneasy optimism. But what passed for preparation was little more than endurance dressed as strategy. They learned to march long distances, to sleep on the ground, to ration food, to ignore pain. Yet no drill could simulate the jungle's suffocating humidity or the silence that followed when a man disappeared into it. Brigadier Orde Wingate, their leader, was unlike any commander they'd known. Charismatic, brilliant, and deeply eccentric, he preached a gospel of irregular warfare. He believed in small, mobile columns striking deep behind enemy lines, self-sufficient, invisible, unpredictable. To some, he was a visionary; to others, a fanatic. He quoted scripture as often as strategy manuals, spoke of divine purpose and personal sacrifice, and regarded conventional officers as prisoners of their own caution. His followers admired him with something approaching faith. His detractors feared his recklessness might cost them all. Among his officers were men barely out of school, Lieutenant John Masters, who would later write that Wingate seemed possessed by a flame no hardship could extinguish. Others spent their last evening before departure writing home, words already tinged with premonition. One slipped a photograph of his wife and newborn daughter into his breast pocket. Another, a Sikh havildar, carried a small pouch of earth from his family's field. A Welsh sergeant wore his wedding ring on a chain so it wouldn't catch on vines. These were their talismans, tokens of another world they might never see again. The Burmese guides who accompanied them offered quiet warnings. "The jungle eats men," one said. "It does not care whose flag you carry." The soldiers laughed then, nervous and naive, as young men always do before they understand what fear can become. When they finally departed, boots clattering onto the wooden docks, engines rumbling toward the northern frontier, they believed they were embarking on a mission of courage and destiny. In truth, they were stepping into a labyrinth built of rain, rot, and silence, where courage would count for less than luck, and faith would be measured in fever and blood. And as the jungle's shadow drew nearer, even Wingate's unwavering conviction would soon be tested by the reality that awaited them beyond the tree line. By early 1943, the British Empire was cornered in Asia. Burma had fallen with shocking speed, its defenses crumbled, its cities seized, its roads swallowed by the relentless advance of Japanese forces. The fall of Rangoon was not just a defeat. It was humiliation incarnate. The empire that once spanned the globe was bleeding in the jungle, and morale across the Allied ranks had collapsed into quiet despair. It was in this moment of chaos that Brigadier Orde Wingate proposed the unthinkable. Rather than retreat, he would strike deeper, cutting through the heart of enemy territory where no conventional army could survive. Operation Longcloth, he called it, a long-range penetration behind Japanese lines. Its purpose was not to conquer land, but to prove that the British could still fight, that the jungle itself could be turned from prison to weapon. His men would move by stealth, supplied entirely from the sky, living off discipline and audacity. Commanders hesitated. The plan bordered on madness, but madness was all the Empire had left to gamble with. And so, in February 1943, Wingate's Chindits prepared to vanish. At dawn, the jungle looked almost serene. A low mist drifted over the Irrawaddy River as the first columns began to move. Pack mules groaned under loads of ammunition and rations. Radios crackled with static. The men tightened their webbing, checked their rifles, and watched as the light dimmed the moment they entered the tree line, as if they decrossed from one world into another. Inside, the air thickened into something you could feel pressing against your skin. The canopy sealed out the sky, trapping heat and shadow in equal measure. Daylight turned to a damp twilight, and within minutes, every man was drenched, not from rain, but from the sweat that poured without pause. The ground pulsed with life. Roots twisted like serpents, vines looped around necks, and unseen insects feasted freely. Boots sank into mud that sucked at every step, and leeches crawled in under gaiters, swelling silently on blood. The jungle was a living organism, and it hated them. Compass bearings faltered under magnetic rock, maps blurred with humidity. Every movement was labor, every breath an effort. Within days, the sharp edges of discipline dulled into exhaustion. Men moved in silence not from training, but because speech required strength they could no longer spare. Yet for all the misery, a strange determination burned among them. They had come to prove something, to themselves, to the Japanese, to the very empire that had sent them. For a time, that belief was enough to carry them through. But as the green darkness closed behind them, the mission's bold vision began to dissolve in the stench of rot and fever. They were no longer soldiers marching toward glory. They were trespassers in a realm that devoured intruders whole. And soon, the jungle would remind them just how easily it could decide who returned and who never would. The jungle was not content to merely resist. It demanded tribute. Every step deeper into Burma became a negotiation with something ancient and merciless, a living cathedral of decay that exacted its price in blood, sweat, and sanity. Within days, the men of the 77th Brigade learned that the Japanese were not their only enemies. Malaria struck without warning, turning healthy soldiers into trembling shells within hours. Fever burned through their ranks like wildfire, drenching men in sweat so profuse it pooled in their boots. Those who survived the first wave faced dysentery, their strength leaking away with every day. The jungle, perpetually wet, infected every scratch. Bandages rotted, wounds blackened, and the air reeked faintly of sickness. They carried 70 pounds on their backs, ammunition, rations, maps, radios, and hope. Each march was a crucifixion of endurance, wading through chest-deep rivers that numbed the skin, clawing up ridges so steep they seemed to scrape the underbelly of the clouds, sliding back down into valleys where leeches writhed in the mud like spilled ink. Progress was measured not in miles, but in bodies left behind. When the first supply drops failed, hunger became a quiet predator. A single tin of bully beef was shared among 5 men. The rice turned rancid. The tea leaves were steeped until they dissolved. Some boiled jungle roots or stripped bark from trees in desperation. Others, too weak to chew, sucked on pebbles to trick the body into swallowing saliva. Water was everywhere and nowhere. Rivers, puddles, rain cascading from leaves. But most of it was poison. Dysentery blurred the line between thirst and death. One survivor later recalled drinking from the muddy footprint of a mule, too delirious to care. Another remembered a friend collapsing mid-march, his eyes glassy, breath shallow. They waited 10 minutes, then 15. Then someone whispered, "We have to move." And so they did, leaving him to the flies and the green silence. Such moments are repeated until they no longer felt like tragedy, but routine. Men began to move like ghosts, their faces blank, their voices monotone. A few laughed without a reason, shrill, exhausted laughter that never stopped. The jungle was devouring not just their bodies, but their minds. Officers called it jungle madness, the slow unraveling of discipline, morality, and self. Some wandered off into the trees at night, certain they saw paths home. Others refused to move at all, sitting cross-legged in the mud as vines curled around them. The Japanese attacks were sporadic but vicious. Ambushes erupted from nowhere, rifle fire and shouting swallowed instantly by foliage. Yet it was the land itself that killed more efficiently. The insects, the rot, the fever, These were its sentinels, defending a kingdom older than empire. One Gurkha sergeant later wrote, "You could not hate the jungle, you could only obey it. It was an adversary that could not be conquered, only survived, and survival came at a moral cost. Every man learned that mercy was weight, and weight got you killed." By the end of the first month, the Chindits no longer looked like soldiers. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving through a world that seemed intent on unmaking them. The jungle had accepted their challenge, and answered with a bargain, "You may enter, but only the worthy will leave." And in the shadows beyond their flickering campfires, something else was beginning to stir. The human enemy, watching, waiting for the jungle to finish what it had started. For a time, the jungle that had tormented them seemed to turn ally. The Chindits became shadows in its endless green halls, ghosts in a living cathedral of vines and mist. After weeks of suffering, they struck back. Under moonlight filtered through leaves, they slipped through enemy lines, set explosives beneath railway bridges, and ambushed Japanese convoys moving along narrow dirt roads. The explosions echoed like thunder through the valleys, steel rails twisted into serpents, trains burning against the night sky. For men who had only known retreat and humiliation, it was intoxicating. They began to believe in the myth Wingate had promised, that small, disciplined bands could bleed an empire. Messages crackled over the radio, filled with cautious triumph. Bridge destroyed. Heavy enemy casualties, moving south. In those brief moments, the impossible felt tangible. The British were fighting back, but the jungle has a way of reclaiming illusions. Success drew attention. The Japanese, veterans of Malaya and Burma, understood this terrain better than any foreign soldier. They studied the patterns of movement, intercepted transmissions, and began to tighten the noose. The Chindits, once invisible, were now being hunted. Radio contact with India faltered. Tropical storms scattered the planes that carried their supplies. Parachutes drifted off course. Crates of food and ammunition vanished into ravines or fell into enemy hands. The few that landed close enough were often found shredded, open by desperate men before the officers could ration them. Wingate realized too late that the mission had reached its limit. The columns were exhausted, half-starved, and isolated. Command and control dissolved into static and silence. Then came the fateful order, his voice crackling through the radios. Break into smaller groups. Make for India independently. It was both an act of necessity and surrender. Without coordination, the jungle swallowed the brigade whole. Some units retained discipline, navigating by compass and instinct, fighting skirmishes as they withdrew. Others simply fell apart. Men drifted away in twos and threes, driven by hunger, fever, or madness. Some walked in circles for days, tracing their own footprints, certain they were heading west. Others collapsed beside empty ration tins, too weak to rise. The jungle grew quiet again, indifferent as ever. The once proud columns were now scattered fragments, ghosts wandering through an empire of green. A few made contact with friendly Burmese villagers who offered food and shelter, often at the cost of their own lives, when Japanese patrols came searching. Many more vanished, their fates unrecorded, their bones lost beneath roots and rain. Wingate's dream of proving that discipline and will could master the wilderness had disintegrated into chaos. The operation that began as a symbol of defiance was now a desperate exodus. In the green cathedral of Burma, the Chindits learned that even victory can carry the scent of death, and that the jungle gives nothing freely. and as the scattered survivors stumbled north, the line between the living and the dead grew perilously thin, blurring into one endless haunted march toward home. At first it was only static, a faint crackle across the wireless in an operations tent somewhere in Assam, where officers leaned over maps dotted with red pins. They waited for the Chindits' nightly signal, coordinates, code phrases, signs of life. But the air stayed empty. Hours passed, then days. The line to Burma had gone dark. Headquarters told themselves it was a malfunction, a storm, interference. But as days bled into weeks, silence hardened into dread. Reports from reconnaissance flights found nothing, no movement, no fires, no trace. In London, in Delhi, and in small villages from Yorkshire to Punjab, families waited by radios that never spoke again. Wives reread telegrams so often that the words began to blur. Mothers kept photographs beside lamps, unwilling to believe that their sons had vanished into air thick enough to breathe. The official channels used phrases like communications disrupted and unit unconfirmed. But among the ranks, whispers spread. Operation Longcloth was lost. Wingate's grand experiment, the Army's bold promise of jungle warfare, had ended not with defeat or surrender, but with the absence. An entire brigade had simply ceased to exist. Yet deep within Burma's interior, men were still alive, though few could say for how long. The jungle had no interest in drama. Its cruelty was slow, methodical, almost tender. A lieutenant, barely 23, kept a diary in the margins of his field manual. The first entries were precise: coordinates, rations, casualties. Then the sentences shortened. Words turned shaky, phrases incomplete. The final line read, "Rained all night, no strength. Ink gone." A Gurkha rifleman carried his wounded British officer for 3 days through mud that rose to his knees. He refused to abandon him, though the officer begged to be left behind. They were found weeks later by villagers, side by side beneath a banyan tree, the rifleman's arm still across his commander's chest, as if shielding him from the rain. Elsewhere, starvation turned comradeship into something brittle and dangerous. One survivor later confessed that men argued over scraps of mule hide boiled into soup, that some hoarded quinine, that others vanished during the night, runaways or victims no one knew. But even amid collapse, flashes of humanity endured. A Sikh havildar shared his last biscuit with a fevered Burmese guide. A British corporal gave his boots to a barefoot private whose feet were torn open by thorns. In such moments, compassion became an act of rebellion against despair itself. Time dissolved. Days were measured by the rise and fall of rain, by the buzzing of insects, by the sound of breath slowing beside you. The jungle offered no horizon, only repetition, green upon green, life feeding endlessly on decay. Death rarely came with violence. It came with quiet, when the will to move simply flickered out. By late April, the operation existed only as rumor. Headquarters debated whether to send rescue missions, but no one knew where to begin. The coordinates were weeks old, the terrain impossible, the monsoon imminent. To search would be to lose more men. Bureaucratic silence replaced human grief, and so, while the world moved on, the Chindits were absorbed into the wilderness. No last stand, no monument, no glorious charge, only the sound of rain falling on unmarked graves, the jungle reclaiming what it had taken. For those waiting back home, the war went on. But for the men who vanished, time ended there. Somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, their memory dissolving into the thick, eternal green, like smoke drifting upward and disappearing into the heavy air. and yet even in silence echoes remained, faint signals from a vanished world, waiting to be heard again. They did not march back in triumph. They stumbled, ragged silhouettes emerging one by one from the jungle's edge, their uniforms in tatters, their skin stretched thin over bone. Villagers along the Indian frontier mistook them for ghosts. In a sense, they were. Months after Operation Longcloth had gone silent, the first survivors began to appear. Emaciated, feverish, eyes sunken into skulls that barely looked human. Medical officers were unprepared for what they saw. The men weighed scarcely half of what they had when they'd marched in. Their bodies were a catalogue of afflictions: malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, worms coiled in their intestines. Many bore untreated wounds, so long neglected they had fused into deformities. A few could no longer walk, their legs too wasted to carry them. The doctors recorded the data, but numbers could not convey the truth. These men were living evidence of what the jungle could do to the human body and to the mind. Those who had left as proud volunteers returned as strangers, even to themselves. They spoke little. When questioned about what they'd seen, some simply stared at the ground. Others laughed softly, as if the question itself were absurd. Sleep came only in fragments. The crack of thunder or the hiss of rain could send them spiraling back into memory. A handful refused to sleep indoors at all. Walls felt like the jungle closing in. When reunions came, they were marked not by joy, but disbelief. Wives fainted at the sight of skeletal figures claiming to be their husbands. Mothers embraced sons they no longer recognized. In Punjab and Lancashire, in Calcutta and Cardiff, the same story played out. Homecomings without celebration, because the men who returned were not the same as those who had left. They carried the silence of the dead within them. Officially, Operation Longcloth was declared a success. Reports praised Wingate's vision, noting that his men had tied down multiple Japanese divisions, proving that long-range penetration behind enemy lines was possible. Medals were awarded, speeches given. Yet to the survivors, those words felt like an epitaph, written for someone else. Success was measured in strategy. Their loss could not be counted that way. One captain wrote years later, "They said we achieved our objective. I suppose we did. But none of us knew what the objective really was by the end." Night after night, survivors woke screaming, dreaming of rivers that whispered their names, of comrades calling from the green darkness. Some drank heavily to keep sleep at bay. Others withdrew entirely, haunted not by what they did, but by the simple fact that they had lived when better men had not. The Empire called them heroes, but they knew better. They were remnants, proof that survival is not always victory. And though the war would rage on, for the Chindits of Operation Longcloth, the battle had already ended, in the endless green, where memory and madness had become the same thing. And from those survivors and their haunted testimonies, a new question began to take shape. One that would shadow the war itself long after the guns fell silent. When the survivors returned, they brought with them a number that could not be reconciled. More than 400 men were simply gone. No reports, no witnesses, no graves, just absence. On paper they were missing, presumed dead. But for families scattered across Britain and India, those 3 words were not closure. They were a wound that never healed. Some had died in combat, ambushed by Japanese patrols that struck and vanished before the echoes faded. Others succumbed to disease, fevered and delirious, collapsing alone in the mud. Many more were captured. marched barefoot through the jungle to Japanese prison camps, where starvation and brutality finished what the wilderness had begun. But there were also those who left no trace at all, men who slipped into the green and were swallowed whole. After the war, recovery teams fanned out across northern Burma, tracing old maps drawn in pencil and hope. They found fragments, a boot sole half buried in roots, a rusted mess tin engraved with initials, bones tangled in vines. Sometimes there were identity discs still clinging to thin chains, their letters faint but legible. Occasionally a wooden cross carved by comrades in haste before retreat, tilted in the soil like a question mark. But for most, there was nothing. The jungle had erased them completely, turning uniforms to mulch and bodies to dust. Families received official letters years later, formal condolences written in careful, bureaucratic language. Regret to inform you that no further information has been obtained. Mothers kept those letters folded in drawers. Widows read them until the creases tore. Some refused to accept them at all, insisting that a body not found was a life not lost. For decades, hope persisted, like an ember that refused to die. In villages along the Chindwin and Irrawaddy, Burmese farmers still unearthed traces of the vanished. A helmet dented by a bullet, a corroded bayonet, dog tags fused with rust, delivered to British authorities by children who had found them in riverbeds. Each discovery was a whisper from the past, a reminder that the jungle had not forgotten, only hidden. Today, the rainforest still keeps its secrets. Trekkers sometimes stumble upon fragments of history, a buckle, a spent cartridge, the skeletal outline of a campfire long gone cold. Each relic is both evidence and elegy, proof that hundreds of men walked into the green, leaving no footprints behind. The official histories record their mission, their bravery, their sacrifice. But the truth is simpler and sadder. They did not die in battle. They disappeared, absorbed by a living world that allows no monuments, no markers, and no return. And somewhere beneath the canopy, the jungle still holds them, silent, nameless, and waiting. History rarely offers clear verdicts, only echoes refracted through time. Operation Longcloth would become one of those echoes, debated and dissected for decades. To some, it stood as a symbol of courage and ingenuity, proof that British and Indian troops could adapt to the jungle and strike deep behind enemy lines. To others, it was a cautionary tale of ambition untethered from reality, a reckless gamble paid for in blood. Brigadier Orde Wingate emerged from the campaign lionized by some and condemned by others. Admirers hailed him as a visionary who dared to reinvent warfare, an innovator who saw the potential of air supply, small unit mobility, and psychological disruption long before they became standard military doctrine. His detractors saw only arrogance, a man so possessed by his convictions that he mistook suffering for strategy. When he died in a plane crash the following year, the myth solidified. Wingate became both prophet and martyr, a figure whose brilliance and flaws could never again be separated. The lessons of Longcloth were written in exhaustion and loss. The British Army learned that jungle warfare was not a matter of strength, but of endurance, adaptability, and logistics. The necessity of airdropped supplies, lightweight equipment, and flexible command structures would shape later Allied operations across Burma and the Pacific. In that sense, the Chindits' suffering had meaning, but it was a meaning purchased dearly. Their memory endured not only in military archives but in stone. In London, at the edge of Victoria Embankment Gardens, stands the Chindit Memorial, a bronze-winged lion, fierce yet mournful, dedicated to the men who fought in the spirit of endurance, courage, and comradeship. Across Myanmar, the Commonwealth War, Graves Commission tends to small cemeteries, tidy rows of headstones set against green hills, marking the few who were found. Each bears a name, a regiment, and the simple epitaph, known unto God. Regimental museums in Britain and India still preserve the relics of that campaign, maps smudged with sweat, diaries written in fading pencil, fragments of uniforms retrieved from the jungle. Each artifact tells the same story, of ordinary men asked to perform extraordinary feats in a world that offered them no mercy. Survivors wrote memoirs and gave interviews in the years that followed, their voices trembling but resolute. Now most of those voices are gone, captured only in grainy documentaries and brittle pages. Each year the remembrance services grow smaller. The veterans who once stood beneath the bronze lion now rest in silence themselves. Yet their story endures because it speaks to a truth older than any war. That valor and futility often walk hand in hand. Operation Longcloth was both triumph and tragedy, its legacy carved not in victory, but in shadow, and in that shadow we still find the measure of what men can endure, and the haunting question of what such endurance is truly worth. But the final reckoning does not belong to history books. It belongs to us, the inheritors of their silence, listening still for the echoes from that endless green. The jungle endures. Trees that once loomed like sentinels over marching columns now tower above a younger forest, roots tangled over forgotten paths. Rivers still wind through the valleys, clear and indifferent, carrying the echoes of men who vanished into their depths. The earth has claimed what was left behind, bones, boots, and memories, and in doing so, made them inseparable from the landscape itself. The Chindits story is not written in headlines or medals. Their battles were fought in shadow and silence, in fevered nights, in rivers that pulled them under, and in mud that refused to let go. Courage, sacrifice, and endurance were measured not in spectacle, but in persistence, in the simple act of surviving one more day, one more step. Yet the cost, seen and unseen, lingers like a whisper across decades, reminding us that war's toll is rarely tidy, rarely acknowledged. To remember them is to honor more than strategy or victory. Say their names, acknowledge the missing, the presumed dead, the slowly fading. Share the stories of family members lost to conflict. Visit memorials virtually. Support veterans' organizations. Preserve their legacies in word, image, and deed. And finally, imagine the jungle at dawn, mist curling through the canopy, sunlight breaking into shards, beautiful and eternal, indifferent to the dramas beneath. But we are not indifferent. We remember. We must remember. Their footsteps may have faded, but their courage, their suffering, and their humanity remain, woven into the green forever. The jungle holds them still, and so must we.